Welcome to the 2024 Nations Report Card in Reading. I am Cory. I am the National Education Correspondent with NPR. I am genuinely happy to be here because I love getting nerdy, especially with people who I deeply respect. That counts for both those here and the stage. And that's especially true when the stakes are high. And I think we can all agree the stakes around this conversation today are quite high.
Most of you, I assume, who are in this room and who are watching us online, thank you for tuning in. I assume you have some sense of the general takeaways from this morning's NAEP release. We are going to give you a quick overview because I believe that optimism is a value. I am just going to highlight a little bit of good news that fourth graders made some gains in math. Yay. But I'm also a realist. Obviously, this newest Nations Report Card is, to quote Dr. Carr in my interview on Morning Edition this morning, sobering, especially in reading. Now, just a heads up about our run of show. Normally, we might talk at you a little more. We're not going to do that today. We really want to hear your questions. So we're going to spend most of our time up here trying to answer your questions, talk about what these results mean, and what they might mean looking forward. So feel free to already start firing questions off. We're going to do a quick introduction here, and then we'll get to them, okay? I need to introduce these folks. On my left is Marty West. Is the Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He is also a member of the Massachusetts State Board of Education and a member of the National Assessment Governing Board, which is obviously why he's up here. And then to my right is Dr. Peggy Carr, Commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics at the U.S. Department of Education. Dr. Carr is going to give us a brief presentation with her highlights, and then we'll get to questions. Dr. Carr?
Well, let me first say that it is indeed an honor to be here today to share the stage with you and Marty. This is an important time for us all, and this is an opportunity for us to really dig into the data. So I'm thinking that we'll start with a video, a very short video, I promise, is only 2 minutes or so. And then I will go through 5 things that you may have missed or we may want to talk about in more detail today. Cory, let me say that 2 years ago when we released these data, oh boy, was it sobering.
Yeah.
And, you and I were talking about it, and clearly we kind of expected it to be what it was. But, it was easier then to communicate what was happening because it was clearly very consistent, steep, troubling declines that were systemic. But today we're talking about something fairly complex to talk about, and it's a different story depending.
One of the biggest questions in education is whether our students' academic achievement has rebounded after the pandemic. Hello, I'm Peggy Carr, Commissioner for the National Center for Education Statistics. I am releasing the latest results of the 2024 National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, also known as the Nations Report Card. It's our second post-pandemic report and the first comprehensive look at whether students' performance has improved since 2022. Unfortunately, the nation has not returned to pre-pandemic levels, and the struggle is most apparent in reading. Yes, while there are a few states and districts that are improving, we don't see the progress we need to reverse the pandemic declines nationwide. In math, we're seeing some encouraging increases, though largely among the highest performing students. For fourth grade, nationally, and for 15 of the states and 14 of the participating urban districts, scores are improving since 2022. At 8th grade, we are seeing progress for higher performing students, but lower performing students continue to decline, widening the achievement gap. The reading story is discouraging. Since 2022, average scores declined in 2024, continuing declines that started before the pandemic. In fact, average scores in reading are at the same level as 30 years ago. Looking more closely at the data, scores for lower performing students are dropping. These results clearly show that students are not where we need them to be or where we want them to be. But there are signs of progress. Student absenteeism, which worsened during the pandemic, improved in 2024. 2 states scored higher than they did pre-pandemic, and some other states and districts have regained lost ground. To see these and other results, visit our report card at nationsreportcard.gov. Thank you.
So there you have it. It's just an overview. What I think we might do next, Cory, is just sort of go through 5 highlights that I can do fairly quickly and perhaps have more discussion about them as we talk today. We'll start with one that perhaps we all know well. Results were more troubling for reading than for math. Let's unpack that a little bit. Down 2 points for grade 4 reading and 2 points for grade 4, 8 and 4 since 2022. But you know, as my video said, it didn't start here. We have been signaling to you and other stakeholders that this decline had already started. The pandemic, yes, it exacerbated what we see here, but it was already happening. It's important to look at the whole distribution, and particularly for these data, because we're seeing patterns that help us understand what all students are experiencing. Fairly consistent here, these asterisks tell us that the decline that we're seeing today is consistent across almost the entire distribution for grade 4 and most of the distribution for grade 8. Now, perhaps the most concerning pattern within our distribution here is for our lowest performing students. Today, these students at the 25th and 10th percentile are performing lower than their counterparts did 30 years ago. And that is true for both 4th grade and 8th grade. Through another lens, the lens of the achievement levels, you can see that this is a sobering finding that we have today. 40% of our 4th graders are scoring below basic. And that is not even an achievement level. We want them to reach basic and then proficient and then advanced. These are students that did not achieve that status. And that is for 4th grade. For 8th grade, a little over a third of the students are in this category. And we can talk more about what that means. But they have not reached mastery of challenging subject matter, which is proficient where we would want them to be. Okay, number 2, higher performing students are improving in math. This you may not have picked up as succinctly as people were reporting these results today, but this is the pattern that is consistent across grade 4 and grade 8. The higher performers, those at the 75th and the 90th percentile, improved. For grade 8, it was an interesting pattern because that was not the case for lower performing students. They were moving in an opposite direction. So we saw a flat score on average in 2022 to 2024 for 8th grade. And that is because the higher performers were improving, but the lower performers, those at the 10th and 25th percentiles, were traveling in the opposite direction, a bifurcation of the results. 4th grade students improving, but particularly at the higher levels. Let's take a look at the states. These are the states that has significant improvement at the higher level. They're 75th and 50th percentile in some cases, but mostly at the 90th percentile. And you can see a lot of states had that pattern, which resulted in the 2-point increase that we see for grade 4 and the higher performers doing well at grade 8. Remember, we have tutors, trial urban district assessment participants, and they are shown here for 17 of them. They also had higher performance evident at the 75th and 90th percentile. And then in a couple of cases, too, we should point out that even for the math, where we see the higher performing going up for 8th grade and lower performers, we have 2 districts that stand out. Another finding that we should probably unpack, gaps between higher and lower performing students are increasing. This is true across several of the grade subject combinations, but particularly for math at grade 8. This is how you can operationalize it by looking at the score points. From 2015 to 2024, it has increased, the gap has increased from 94 points to 109 points. And those asterisks there tell us that this gap has gotten consistently larger over time, such that it is the largest, widest gap we have ever seen recorded in this assessment. A similar pattern is happening for these students as well, but the difference here is that the gap is taking a different pattern. The higher performing students are improving, but the lower performing students are kind of holding steady. The result is still a widening of the gap. That was for grade 4 math. There are signs of progress, and I'm hoping we can unpack them today. 31 states, not significantly different from 2019, the pre-pandemic data point. 20 states, not significantly different from 2019 in reading. And we should end on a good note, perhaps the most encouraging note. 2 states exceeded their pre-pandemic scores. Alabama in grade 4, 7 points up from their pre-pandemic level. And Louisiana in grade 4 reading, where clearly we were having a lot of challenges, up 6 points from their pre-pandemic level.
Well, and Dr. Carr, I think I just noticed in those 2 graphs as well, in the math graph with Alabama leading, Louisiana's right in its shadow.
Oh yeah, how about that?
And in the reading graph, if you look with Louisiana leading, Alabama's right in their shadow.
A pair.
If Alabama and Louisiana are out there watching,
Please stand up.
on the internet, please stand up.
So that's it. So maybe we can talk a little.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit. Let me check, actually, first of all, Laura, since I gave the call out to questions earlier, if there are any questions available already, I'm happy to take one, or we can get rolling.
Yes, thank you for asking. We have a question about Black student and Hispanic student performance. We're curious about that.
All right, Black student and Hispanic student performance. What did we notice in the trend lines between 2024 and 2022?
Well, there was something that stood out for Black students that may not have come out in the results. The Black students in reading seem to be holding their own. They did not decline. Very similar to what we saw for grade 8 reading last time, if you recall. So I thought that was worth pulling out of the results. The Hispanic students, on the other hand, continued to decline. We saw double declines for them from 19 to 22, and again from 22 to 24. So perhaps we need to have conversations about how to unpack that data as well.
I will also add, because I've spent so much time looking over this data too, I know in 4th grade math, this is when you look at the averages, but in 4th grade math, I believe it was white, Black, Hispanic, and economically disadvantaged students all made gains when you look at the average. Now, obviously, excuse me, as Dr. Carr highlighted in this presentation, sometimes it's risky looking at the average because when we're talking about 8th grade math, you get this really worrying divergence where the higher performers are shooting off like a rocket and their gains mask the fact, if you're just looking at the average, that the lower performers are actually losing ground. But
yeah, well, I looked at those data and the higher performers for those subgroups seem to be pushing them up. So they were very similar to what we were seeing at the national level when you saw an increase.
I'm wondering, Marty, I want to get you involved here too. What sort of historical context can you give us for this kind of divergence? Because we were talking earlier that, it wasn't that long ago that we actually saw lower performing students pulling up scores, lifting the average. And now we're seeing the exact opposite.
Yeah, that's right, Cory. The main NAEP, which the results of which are being presented and released today, was launched in the early 1990s. And starting in about the middle part of that decade, we actually saw a period of steady progress that lasted. It wasn't as fast as people wanted, and sometimes people were frustrated by that, but it was quite steady and quite consistent over time until about 2010, when we saw scores start to stagnate and slip downward. But what was striking about the improvements during that period was that it was accompanied by the exact opposite of what we saw on Dr. Carr's last slide. It was accompanied by a narrowing of those gaps in achievement between low achievers and high achievers. And so, we often have this habit in education of running to new fads, or when we get results from something like the NAEP, to find those positive outliers and go see what they're doing in real time. I think we might be in a moment in American education where we need to think, let's look backwards at what we might have been doing at that time and find out if there are any lessons from the past rather than the next new thing.
Well, so, you lead me to the one word that I don't think I'm usually allowed to use when we talk about NAEP, and that is why. But truly, if we, because I had this conversation over and over and over again over recent days preparing these stories, why did we see the narrowing of the gap in the early aughts up to 2011, 2012, 13, and then what lessons do we draw from this?
Now, Cory, you know better.
I know. Take my mic.
Well, let me say, I remember reporting, Marty, we were both around then. I remember reporting those results, particularly for math, and saying, this is a good way to close the gap when the bottom of the distribution is coming up faster than the top. And we were able to say that for several of the releases, and you're absolutely right now, the opposite is happening. The closest I can come perhaps to addressing your question is that it was math where we saw this, where math seems to be, even now, is going in the opposite direction for some students, but it seems to be really amenable to within school instruction, more so, more responsive to within school instruction. So maybe that's what was happening around that time.
I mean, go ahead.
I'll jump in and say, I think you're right, first of all, to say that NAEP data is far better at telling us what's happening to student achievement than why. It's more often the starting point for questions rather than the answer. But there is good evidence, some of which uses NAEP data, that really does suggest a lot of that progress in the 1990s and 2000s was driven by the adoption of test-based accountability systems, first at the state level and then nationally under No Child Left Behind. That's not to say that those systems didn't have all sorts of unintended consequences. That's not to give policy advice. But as you look for explanations for these patterns, I think we have to acknowledge that being part of the story. I also think as we look for the answer to why questions, we need to be looking both at education and in-school factors and at things that could be going on outside of schools. And so as I look at the more recent trends, I think it obviously comes to mind that we should be looking at what social media and the rise of the screen-based childhood is doing for reading habits and reading skills. We know from NAEP data there's been a sharp decline in the share of students who report reading frequently outside of school for fun. That's not to say we know that this causes, but I'm intrigued by the screens hypothesis because I could actually imagine it being something that creates both declines at the bottom and at the same time accelerates students at the top, because screens can be a remarkable source of enrichment if you know how to use them right. So probably going a bit beyond what I should do in my role as vice chair of the governing board, but you asked a good question.
Yeah, Marty, but we're going to ask you guys about putting some of those questions on the NAEP questionnaire. And we'll be coming to you because we do think we need to ask some contextual questions around devices and how schools are using them and what students are saying about the use of these devices for their own personal use and within classrooms. So a question that we're going to be discussing with the board in due time.
Yeah, I mean, there was even a data point in the NAEP around asking, I think it was students or was it teachers, about the length of passages they're asked to read, and some suggestion over time that even in school, we're asking students to actually read less, which is kind of alarming. I want to get to another question online, and then I promise, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you. There are lots and lots of
lots and lots. All right.
Through the chat. One question relates to this contextual issue about attendance. Someone's asking to understand the score changes in light of changes in attendance patterns.
Absenteeism. Did I hear that question right? Yeah, I think we can all join in on this one. You know, we asked this question of our students. We asked them to provide, how many days have you been out of school in the last 30 days? That's a question we've been asking, Marty, for many, many years. So we kept that consistent so we could have a reliable trend. We also asked their teachers and we asked their schools about chronic absenteeism as defined by 10 days or more. Things have gotten better. That's the good news. But they're not back to where they were in 2019. So some improvement, but not enough. And this wouldn't be so worrisome if we had not found a consistent and strong correlation between absenteeism and student performance. You have to come to school to learn.
Yeah, when I saw that data point, I was channeling Hetty Chang, just thinking, you can't learn if you're not in the room. Anything you want to add about the chronic absenteeism?
Well, I would just say it's one of the many reasons why, while I found the results disappointing, sobering, I did not find them all that surprising. And as I've had conversations with journalists and others about the results, I think a lot of people do find them surprising. And I think that's because a lot of us naturally think about learning loss in sort of the wrong way. We think that if you have a disruption to a child's education and you get them back in school and learning under normal conditions, that they would naturally catch back up, that, you know, we would see scores recover. But actually, if all you did was get kids back in school under normal learning conditions, they resume learning, you'd actually expect to see whatever initial deficit you saw persist over time. And of course, we didn't get kids back in school under normal learning conditions, and chronic absenteeism is one of the signs that that was the case. It had doubled over the course of the pandemic. And so to me, it's not surprising that we've seen not even less than a full recovery, but continued declines in reading in particular over this time period.
All right.
Well, you know, I was going to say, you know, 2 points do not make a trend. Now we have 3. And when you look at these data, particularly for absenteeism, and you look at the opposite end of that same question, what you see is something that looks like maybe a new normal emerging that we got to keep an eye on, because those students that say they never miss any school, well, there are less of them than we had before. So we have a lot to keep an eye on for absenteeism.
You want to ask your question now?
So it's a little bit of a statement and then a question. I am so thrilled to hear you talk about the things outside the classroom. I'm Trish Brennan-Gag from Maryland Reads, and this shift to the science of reading for instruction is critical and it's a top priority. But if 95% of kids are capable of becoming proficient readers, that's not the only route to get there. And so at Maryland Reads, what we realized is we have to talk about what's happening outside the classroom. So if we launched the Read Strong Network, we're now starting a conversation about thriving reading ecosystems. But we're also looking at barriers. And so I really appreciated when you brought up the role of social media and technology, because we posed the question, if the science of reading is telling us how the brain learns to read, and we're hearing about addictive technologies rewiring the brain, is that rewiring, unwiring the science of reading instruction? So we launched a conversation called The Digital Dilemma this past year, and we partnered with the Albert Shanker Institute and Marianne Wolf, the author of Read or Come Home. And we found out, we thought there would need to be original research, but we found out there's actually research that does show that the overuse and inappropriate use of technology is having an impact on that proficiency rate. So I'm so pleased that you raised that. And my question is, are researchers in the United States looking at this? Because if not, then this is a call to action that we need to get some hard research on that. And thank you for raising it.
So I should make clear that I am not an expert in the science of reading. Thank you for your question and your work. I think one of the natural questions that comes out of this NAEP release is, what does the decline in reading scores tell us about the recent efforts to promote the science of reading as a pedagogical strategy? And I think there I would caution us to sort of avoid jumping to conclusions. A lot of that activity has been quite recent and quite focused on the early grades. It's in early stages of being implemented, and I don't think we would expect it to be showing up in the fourth grade NAEP data at this point. And as you say, there could be countervailing forces of all kinds. So I think we need to look at sort of other evidence to inform the instructional approach. I will say it's interesting, Cory, when you plan your trip to the Gulf Coast, to Alabama and Louisiana, I really do think it would be worth looking at what Louisiana is doing.
All the other reporters who are watching this are going to do the same thing now,
Yeah,
Marty.
it's very convenient, Alabama and Louisiana together. But you asked about research. I know there are a lot of people looking at this. I can't speak to the specifics of it in real time.
I was going to say, talk to those with boots on the ground. So when you get down there, ask them what they're doing. They are using science of reading, but a lot of other states are too. So they're doing something else. It's making this come through.
I mean, just to add to what Marty said, my hunch with the science of reading movement is that it's still relatively nascent in many places, and the laws that states passed are, generally speaking, too new, I think, for us to see any results in a NAEP test that was administered this time a year ago. Don't forget that. Do not assume that these results mean the science of reading doesn't work. That's not it. I actually have one related question that's super interesting to me, and I don't know what to make of it, if we should make anything of it. And that is, for those of you doing the math out there and looking at the kids that this test in particular is looking at, who were fourth graders and eighth graders last year, is there anything unique to their experiences as kids who, the fourth graders at least, so they left school at the beginning of the pandemic in kindergarten. So their early literacy instruction was interrupted. Their sort of foundational numeracy instruction was interrupted. Is it possible that they would be harder hit than other cohorts in this line?
Well, I wish you'd asked the question about eighth grade, because that's where I think it's most relevant.
There you go. Tell me.
Because think about what they missed. They were fourth graders. They were fourth graders. And then if you believe what happened in the fifth grade, complete chaos in some situations, they missed a lot. And what do you need to do to prepare for middle school math? You need pre-algebra concepts. You need to know about fractions. You need to know your timetables very well. So what we're seeing here is that those students who missed that, or perhaps didn't get, the strong enough instruction in that, if you were The higher performing students, well, you're sort of springing back. But if you're lower performers, well, you're not. So I think that there's something there that we need to sort of unpack. Experts, we have to ask those who really are experts in this area of what you're supposed to be learning during this time period and how that correlates with the results that we're seeing today.
Yeah, just to add one quick thought, I think it's easy to tell stories or generate hypotheses about how different stages of education would have been more critical or disruptive if they had been missed. I've been struck as you look across other assessment programs, state tests, and other large-scale assessments like the NAEP. It's been very hard to find a really consistent pattern that younger students who were younger with the disruption had less or more of a challenge. I think education is a cumulative process, and that's why we need to provide students with an opportunity, regardless of the age they were at, to make up the instructional time that they missed.
We'll take another question.
Yeah, we have a question about, this shifts the topic a little bit, but have there been population shifts over the last 30 years that could impact the interpretation of the trends?
So have there been population shifts over the last 30 years that could impact how we read these trends?
Well, we keep a strong eye on that. We do something called population standardization whenever these data are released, particularly with long-term trend, because it really goes back and there's been a lot of shift. And we examine what the scores look like before and after standardizing the results. And if we see something there, that gives us, pause and concern. And we've done this and we have none. We have even conducted this time around because, COVID, this analysis within state. And again, some variation, you're going to see some variation, but for the most part, we're not concerned about reporting these results as accurate and reliable.
All right, next question. Oh, we got one in the room over here.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Karina Escalante. I'm here with the Education Trust, and I'll stand just because the former educator and teacher in me loves to. And thank you for bringing us in community to discuss these results. I work primarily to advocate for youth participatory action research, so thank you for calling me in with your earlier question. And my question is, I'm grateful that we can all come and be together in community to discuss the implications of these critical findings and determine next steps and future directions. My question is, what opportunities are there or could there be for our young people to have a seat at the table, both figuratively and literally? When I think about the timing of this event, it's Wednesday at 1 p.m. on a weekday. It's during school hours, so we create a barrier for our young people to come and be a part of the conversation. And I'm wondering, is there an advisory board made up of students and youth that they can, we can bounce these ideas off of when you come to the board with these new questions that you want to include? Research does show that advisory boards and giving young people more agency and that position in the driver's seat can really lead to some of those more vocal, creative solutions and leverage the increased access to technology that our young people have. I think as adults, we do have these stereotypical and sometimes deficit perspectives of our young people that bringing them in with an agentic role might be able to shift and create some more multi-dimensional, creative solutions to our complex issues when it comes to academic achievement.
Thank you for that. And I will say I agree, and that's part of my job. My favorite part about my job is going out into schools and taking what I hear from folks like Marty and Dr. Carr and filtering it through to their experience. I think that's super important. And I would encourage all the journalists out there who are watching this, encourage them to find the districts and the schools and the classrooms near them or not so near them that help illustrate these stories and that can include the voices and vital life experiences of the students whose narrative arcs we see in this data. We know it's not good. But you're absolutely right. We need to hear from them how they're experiencing it.
I can
Yeah.
talk a little bit about how we try to incorporate student voice into the National Assessment Governing Board's activities. So the National Assessment Governing Board that oversees the NAEP program comprises representatives of state and local government. So not students directly, but many of those are educators, and those educators are constantly pushing us to find strategies to include student voice. And we've even had some conversations around the possibility of forming a more formal student advisory panel. Some of our best sessions at our quarterly board meetings are those where we invite student panels to come wrestle with us with some of the issues that we're working on, whether it be how to respond to the emergence of AI, how to think about the experiences that they had during the pandemic and how we could capture that in the survey questions that we ask. We also have each of our one quarterly board meeting each year in the home jurisdiction of one of our members. And that always includes one or more school visits and opportunities to engage with students. So there clearly are ways to build on what we do, but we try to be as responsive as possible to the perspective that you articulated.
Cory, if I could just add one point. I looked over at Marty because I was trying to remember the last time we released NAEP data together, and I think we were together, the two of us, and we had a panel. I think it was
Yes.
Was it long-term trend?
Yes.
Yeah, and we had a student panel following the release to do exactly what you just described. We asked them pointed questions about the results that we were releasing that day, and we learned a lot. And we do that often, not perhaps often enough, but we do that often. Sometimes we actually release at schools. I think this was actually done at a school, is my recollection.
All right, I have a question I realize I need to get to, and it is a letter from the Florida State Commissioner of Education, Manny Diaz, who is questioning the validity of Florida's NAEP results, specifically arguing the changes in the administration of the test impacted students and should be limited. We must address issues in the composition of the NAEP sample. School choice is a national trend, seeing tremendous growth and must be accounted for in NAEP. And the letter concludes, I firmly support President Trump's belief the U.S. Department of Education should be abolished. And he calls on the acting Secretary of Education to make NAEP great once again. And I just want to give you a chance to respond to this letter.
Marty, why don't you go first?
All right. Well, so we should acknowledge that Florida, we talked more about positive outliers a moment ago. Florida is a state that, according to the NAEP data, suffered some further declines between 22 and 24 in 3 of the assessments that we released results for today. And so it's not surprising that they would want to ask questions about the validity of the results. We've had the opportunity to look at what they've articulated as potential concerns and we think we have good answers to those questions. So, for example, they raised questions about the composition of the sample. That is, which schools in Florida were selected to represent the performance of all of the students in the state. It's obviously essential that you get a representative sample in order to have valid and reliable data. And NCES goes to great lengths to ensure that that's the case. That process actually involves states signing off in advance on the representativeness of their sample. So Florida had the opportunity to do that and did in fact sign off. And so it's a little surprising to hear them raising questions about it after the fact. The letter is right in saying that there were some changes to the administration of NAEP, specifically the use of devices that students have already in their schools that they're more familiar with rather than devices that NAEP programs supplied. And that's actually why today's results are being released in January rather than October, which is typically the case, because NCS had to carry out what's known as a bridging study to really kick the tires and make sure that that wasn't compromising the results. And that study was vetted by a lot of people internally, as well as by a technical advisory committee. And needless to say, we're confident in what we're releasing today. And then finally, the issue of private schools participating. It is correct to say that the state level NAEP data are for public school students only, and we're very clear about that. That's how it should be interpreted. We would actually love it. The governing board would love it if more private schools would agree to participate when they're selected in the sample. The reason we can't report state level data is that those participation rates aren't quite high enough. And so we would love to work with states to increase the share of private schools who respond to the invitation to play a role in NAEP. But for now, we can report results for public school students only, and that's what we've done.
Well, nicely stated, Marty. Let me say that we're often accused of dancing on the head of a pin when it comes to technical rigor and being really methodical about any changes, understanding any changes done to NAEP. In this case, we're guilty. We did dance on the head of a pin when it came to moving from the typical way we administer NAEP with devices in a school and all of the content on the device, and moving to an online presentation of the data. And we did it both, and we did it in a scientifically defensible way with samples of students randomly assigned to these various conditions so that we could take the time, as Marty pointed out, to analyze any impact, and we saw none. We, of course, and there's always room for additional analysis and improvement, and we're going to go back and we're going to see what happened if any of the accusations that I'm hearing happen in Florida. We will be able to unpack them because we also have a summary of everything that happens in any school when we administer an assessment. So these are empirical questions that have answers with data. So we'll see.
All right. Let's go back to online question.
Thank you. There is a question that asks, could the shift to computerized testing explain any of the trends over the last decade? So this is not about NAEP computerized testing, but I think computerized testing in general.
No. That dancing on the head of a pin, we really had a strong bridge study back in 2017. I recall not only did we bridge at the national level, we bridged at every single state and tutor so that we could see and be able to defend strongly and with evidence that we had no significant impact based upon paper and pencil and device on the findings. And we were able to analyze the data both ways and defend the scores that were reported out. So the answer is an emphatic no.
And that's, just to be clear, that's distinct from the hypothesis that the rise of the use of screens for literacy and math instruction in schools could have played a role in contributing to what students know and are able to do. And you know that's different from what we're talking about, which is the use of those technologies for the completion of the assessment itself.
All right. Next question.
There's a question about how to understand state assessment results within the context of the NAEP state data and how those kind of speak to each other or not.
I think we should talk about maybe our NAEP mapping study. We do it every 2 years with these data for this reason, so that we can have a conversation about how state data can be evaluated in the context of a common metric, NAEP. I mean, that's the one thing that I think sets us apart. It is the same assessment administered everywhere in the nation. with the same questions, and there is defensible trend lines across time psychometrically. But states are free to do what they think is best for their students. So they have their own tests. They have their own decisions that they make defensively about where to put their cut points. And so every 2 years, we map state standards onto a common metric, NAEP scale, so that we can evaluate what it means to be proficient in Ohio or in Florida or in North Carolina using the NAEP vernacular. So I invite you to look for that very, very informative policy study that we produce every 2 years.
Yeah, one of the things I like to point out is that it's the NAEP program that makes the world safe for state tests, right? Or that provides the infrastructure for holding state testing programs reliable. It makes it, here's what I should say, it makes it safe for educators, stakeholders around the nation to rely on state tests because when proficiency standards have been lowered or set at a inadequate level, the NAEP program, the study that Dr. Carr mentioned, can make that clear.
All right. Is there a question in the room?
There is. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this wonderful conversation this afternoon. Ray Hart with the Council of Great City Schools. And you mentioned studying Alabama, studying Louisiana. I know that there are a number of districts that also participate in NAEP. In fourth grade mathematics, there were several of them, and the large cities overall were significantly higher. And their magnitude was about twice, not quite twice, the nation's recovery in mathematics. Several districts are also, the majority of them actually, in 3 grade subject areas are not significantly different from where they were in 2019. Is there anything we can learn from the districts, in addition to your conversation about the states, that might help inform the nation's recovery and where we go?
I'm sure the answer is yes. There's a lot in this release. As Dr. Carr made clear, we have the overall picture contrasted with different starting points. We have the state data and the district data. So I apologize that we haven't called out that as a learning opportunity as well. But just as Cory should be visiting the Gulf Coast, one of his colleagues should be headed out to the most promising candidates in the TUDA districts as well.
Yeah, I would say we should find models that work wherever they are. And when you look through those data, there clearly are opportunities, whether you're talking about Denver or Boston, I think had an interesting finding. Yes.
Yeah, and I'll just add, there was a, I'm trying to remember what it was. Sorry, there was such a flurry of data. But in the digital story we published at NPR, there was a section where we called out a handful of districts that did exceptionally well, saw really large gains, specifically among economically disadvantaged kids, gains in the 9, 10, 11 points category. I think it was Charlotte Mecklenburg. I can't remember if it was math or reading, but it was Charlotte Mecklenburg. I know San Diego was on the list. So DC did well as well. Thank you for the question. Online question from Laura.
This will be the last question,
Okay.
because we are nearing the end. What kind of data does NAEP collect on special education students? There's been interest on the chat about special education students and their performance.
All right. So the question is around data gathering on special education students and their performance. Can you tell us?
I'm going to look to my colleague here. I don't remember the special ed data as well as I should. What I recall is that they did decline. And they declined for grade 8 in mathematics. That is I'm right on that. That is remember the finding where we had diverging trends with students at the top scoring higher and students at the bottom dropping. These students are in that bottom part of the distribution. That is what I recall. Now, why? I think that is why we have all of these contextual variables. And we have them for students and for their teachers and what the teachers are asking them to do. And how long have they been in an English language curriculum or not? These are the kinds of questions I think these data can allow us to ask ourselves.
Do you want to toss to Grady? He's got a mic. No,
Grady,
no,
have you got anything to add with what I said?
No.
I'll just add, Laura, if I heard the question correctly, it was phrased as what kinds of data does NAEP collect on special education? The reason Dr. Carr is able to answer with Grady's help that question about how students with disabilities have fared over time is that we do include students with special education in the NAEP program. They're allowed to use accommodations. There's very close monitoring to the very, very unusual cases in which a student can be excluded from testing. So while the news is not always good, as Dr. Carr was saying, it wasn't this year, we think the NAEP program is important to be able to track a population of students that is often ignored.
And I will just say, as the reporter who's obsessed with anecdata, I spent a big chunk of last year and the year before reporting on shortages among special education staff. So it surprises me not at all to see declines in performance. And this is just one of the many things that we need to focus on, pay attention to. So we're at wrap up. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone in the room. I want to thank everyone watching at home or wherever you are. I want to thank Dr. Peggy Carr and Marty West. It's been a pleasure. Go do good work. Thank you.